To lead our discussion today, I would like to introduce you to the session moderator, Dr. Alice Chen. Dr. Chen is a program officer in the Office of Rare Diseases Research, where she works with the ORDR team to advance diagnosis and treatment for rare diseases through research. Dr. Chen came to NCATS in November 2017 from the FDA, where she had been working since 2014 in the Office of Translational Sciences, which is part of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Chen received her bachelor's degree in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and her medical degree from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Chen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on getting involved in clinical research, finding and preparing for clinical trials. My name is Alice Chen, and I have the honor of moderating this session with our amazing speakers today. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this annual event that has become so popular. My role at NIH is within the Office of Rare Diseases Research, which is part of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. To start off with a few introductory remarks, here is the NIH definition of a clinical trial. It is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. As seen on the slide, several of these key words are further defined by NIH at their respective hyperlinks. According to the NIH definition, research studies must answer yes to all four questions listed here. Additional clinical trials-related resources can be found at the link listed at the bottom. If you're wondering about how you can find a clinical trial, clinicaltrials.gov is a valuable resource. In the screenshot here, you can see that one of the data points to search by is your rare disease. This is a database that has clinical studies from all over the world. Another resource, if interested in learning about clinical trials at the NIH specifically, is the Office of Patient Recruitment that is part of the NIH Clinical Center. The information specialists in this office are available to talk to you about clinical trials conducted at the NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland. The information on the right lists the office's phone number and email address if you would like to contact one of these information specialists directly. Next, I will talk briefly about a few rare diseases resources from my center at the NIH, also known as NCATS. First is the NCATS Toolkit for Patient-Focused Therapy Development. It is a centralized collection of online resources that can help patient groups advance through the research and development process for new treatments. Here is a screenshot displaying the various steps. As you see in the red circle, one of the sections is focused on preparing for clinical trials. If the user decides to click on this and wants to learn more, the resource is set up to dive deeper with several subtopics seen along the top. Each of these sections is broken out into additional details, which are easy to navigate using the pane on the left. The next resource is the NCATS Rare Diseases Registry Program, or RADAR. It is a resource that provides guidance for setting up and maintaining high-quality registries that are based on best practices and data standards. The website is set up similar to the toolkit with these three tiles seen here. As the user navigates through, it is similar with subtopics within the bigger buckets and additional pages of detailed information found within those. Here is a screenshot of learning about registries, which is found under the Get Started tab. And lastly, for those who are not aware, NCATS offers free materials and resources to help patients, caregivers, patient support organizations, and more learn about rare diseases and help advance research on them. The materials found at the link seen on the bottom are available for you to use on social media, web pages, at meetings, or other places. Our hope is that this makes it more convenient for you to raise awareness and to connect with the rare diseases community. Thank you again for joining us. And now I would like to turn it over to our wonderful speakers, Natasha Fitter and Kim Nye.
Thank you, Alice, so much for that introduction. And I learned a few things as well. So I'm really happy to be here. My name is Nasha, and I run the FOXG1 Research Foundation, and I also lead our rare disease initiatives at Citizen. Um, you know, I am just like all of you. I am a parent who has a child with a rare disorder. That's my daughter Amara in the picture. She's 5 years old now. She started having seizures when she was 7 months old, and we found out that she has a diagnosis of FOXG1 syndrome. And as a parent, like so many of you, I refused to believe what people were telling me, and I am spending my life looking for a cure for her and for other children with FOXG1 syndrome. And if I have to, I'll have to disrupt and innovate in the space to do so. And I think nobody knows the urgency that a parent feels. So what I hope to show you today are a few things that you can do to prepare yourself for clinical trials and to do the work necessary. So the end goal, as we think about, all of the work that we're doing in patient advocacy, is to get to hopefully a clinical trial. And what is, Alice went through like what exactly is a clinical trial. For you to be successful, and the work that we can do as we're waiting for this day to come, is really focusing around clinical endpoints. And endpoints is really a measurable event. So, for example, when you administer a drug for a child, you want to see an endpoint could be, does the child start to mobilize? Do they start to walk? Do they start to move? That would be an endpoint. And in order to do a clinical trial successfully, we need to know what would that child's life had been like if there was no drug in the picture. So what would their natural history trajectory be without a drug? And that's why you'll hear, natural histories and patient registries and all of this information. It's very important at the time you get to a clinical trial. It's also very important for us as parents to have that data so we can better understand our children's diseases and what the community is going through. So the first thing, there's many things you need to do. I'm going to go in order, and the first one is really creating a contact database of patients. For you to even get into a registry and a natural history platform, the first thing is you need to know who are your patients. So I'll give you an example of what we did at FOXG1 Research Foundation. And of course, this is just our experience, and you must have your own experiences. So take what you can from this. The first thing we did is we went through all of the support groups that were online. And in our case, the majority of them were on Facebook. And we just started finding parents that way and caregivers that way. And we put it in an Excel, a Google Sheet to begin with. Just who are the caregivers? How can we get in touch with them? And that's how we knew first and foremost, how many children could we even contact? The next step was setting up a registry. There are many registry platforms, and I'm not here to advocate one versus another. What I am here to tell you is when you look for a registry platform, you want to look at a couple features. One, it has to be IRB approved. Two, and very importantly, is that you must have access to your own data. There are platforms where you join and then yourself as the advocacy group cannot access that patient data. That is not very helpful. You need to have access. You also need to make sure that academia and biopharma have access to that data, and easily. In the end of the day, it's biopharma who's going to create the drug for your child, so you don't want to put up roadblocks for them to access data to help them to do so. And you want to make sure that you stick to validated surveys. This is something that we learned the hard way. When we started our registry, we created surveys and sent them out and realized that if they're not validated, then they will likely not be able to be used by the FDA. So you want to look for validated surveys. And in our case, we had a genetic counselor on our scientific advisory board that really helped us verify mutations. So we asked our parents to upload a genetic report, and then we verified that they actually did, in fact, their children did, in fact, have FOXG1 syndrome. This was really important. So that's the second step, is setting up your registry. And a registry is really for patient-reported outcomes. And then you need to get parents to actually join your registry, and this could be much harder than you think. So what we did is we set up parent leads across the world, and we ran it like a business. We had parents, we said, look, these are the caregivers in your area. Please explain what the registry is. Conduct webinars. We sent out messages on social media. And then we gave back to our caregivers. So these are just two small examples of graphs we created. Where is everyone located and what types of mutations? There's more in-depth graphs that we've also created, but you want to give back constantly to your, your parent and caregiver community so they feel like participating in these platforms. The third step is around clinical data. So a registry is really patient-reported outcomes, or in our cases, caregiver-reported outcomes, where a natural history is where clinicians will enter data. So this is very important, and pairing it with your patient-reported outcomes is where it becomes quite powerful. And again, there's many ways to do a natural history study. There's in-person studies, there's various platforms that will do digital natural history studies. I'm not here to advocate one way or the other, but there are a few things you want to make sure with whatever platform or partner you choose. Again, making sure you have access to your own data, that academia has access for free. You want them to publish on your data. And biopharma can easily access the data. And you want to make sure, and I see this mistake all the time, that you connect your patients back to their registry, because you need that linkage. Otherwise, both those platforms operate in silos. So it's really critical. I wanted to just give you an example of what I mean by, this is another example of what I mean by a clinical endpoint. So here is my daughter's, one of her neurology notes. And so within our natural history study, you can get an idea of what we're doing. We're taking her raw medical records and we're actually pulling out terms that can be used as clinical endpoints. So generalized hypotonia, hyperkinesis, her grossly intact sensations. These are all seeing how that progresses throughout her life is what we can measure, measurable clinical endpoints. And this is why a natural history study is so critical. Okay. The next thing to think about is setting up your biobank. And so what is a biobank? It's basically a repository where you can collect skin and blood samples. And then you can turn these into fibroblasts, iPSC lines, LCL lines if it's blood. And you want it to be in a situation where they can ensure quality control. And again, I know I keep saying this again and again and again, but so many groups make this mistake. Whatever repository you choose, you want to make sure there is easy accessibility to academia and biopharma. You want to make sure that they are not going to charge biopharma an arm and a leg to access these, these assets, because otherwise they'll just move on to the next rare disease. There are so many now. And back to the identifiers, you want to make sure that your biobank unique identifiers are connected to your registry and any natural history study you do. Then you have actual longitudinal N of 1 data that was going to be very helpful. The last point I'll say is, as we think about endpoints, we've been talking about endpoints in our children, so collecting their natural data. It's also important to find endpoints in your assets, so models of your children's symptoms. In our case, we have taken our skin samples and turned them into induced pluripotent stem cells and created neuronal lines as well as 3D brain organoids, which we are characterizing. So characterizing is basically a fancy word to also mean finding measurable endpoints. Here are a couple I wrote down: abnormal cell death, proliferation of cells. So that is an actual endpoint that if we test a drug, we can see what changes within this endpoint. In our case, we also have mouse models. Mice may not be the right animal for a drug. We can see what that right animal is. And then again, find the measurable endpoints, molecular endpoints, seizures, behavioral endpoints, and document them. You're going to need this for your preclinical work to actually see if the drugs you're testing can have a measurable impact. So that's just a quick summary of things that you as a patient group, and there's times where you feel so helpless, you're waiting for a biotech to come in, but there's a lot of work you can do that you need to do to de-risk. And I hope I've given you some ideas around that.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. It's an absolute honor. My name is Kim Nye, and I am the founder of TESS Research Foundation, where our mission is to improve the lives of those impacted by SLC 13A5 epilepsy. Nasha did a fantastic job describing clinical trial readiness from the patient advocacy group perspective, and now I'm going to discuss clinical trials more from the patient or family perspective. Next. Like so many in the audience today, my family is directly affected by rare disease. I'm going to spend 1 minute giving you an overview of what the past 17 years have looked like for our family so that you have an idea of why we participated in clinical trials. My husband and I were young graduate students when our daughter Tessa was born in 2003. We thought we were having a healthy baby, but Tessa began having seizures shortly after birth for no apparent reason. We saw her diagnosis shift from benign idiopathic neonatal seizures, meaning doctors couldn't figure out why Tessa was having seizures, but they thought she would be okay, to catastrophic epilepsy, meaning we weren't sure she would survive until kindergarten. Medication, surgeries, diets, and research all failed Tessa for more than a decade. She was having hundreds of seizures a day, but we had no idea why. 10 years after Tessa was born, our world came crashing down when I gave birth to our fourth child, a little boy named Colton. He seemed healthy, but just like his big sister, Colton began having seizures shortly after birth. He was only hours old, but I knew my son would never talk or dress himself. Colton's birth made the medical puzzle a bit easier. A genetics researcher was able to find a genetic marker for the disease, SLC13A5. But we had to figure out whether this diagnosis was the finish line or the beginning of a race toward a cure. Our neurologist agreed that diagnosis should not be the end of the journey and that we should use this genetic knowledge and translate it into reasonable precision medicine trials. If the goal of a clinical trial is to improve the health and quality of life of a patient, it's important to think about what the disease looks like. In our case, I started to hear from more and more families across the country and around the world who had received an SLC13A5 epilepsy diagnosis, and it became clear that we had a newly discovered rare disease with a consistent set of symptoms. All of our children began seizing shortly after birth. The seizures were really hard to stop with seizure medications. Our kids could barely speak, but they could clearly understand so much. They had a movement disorder that meant that they walked very late in life, if ever. The disease affects both boys and girls of all races and ethnicities, and it's a monogenic disease with recessive inheritance, so many of our families have 2 or even 3 affected children. This information becomes really important for clinical trial design, including endpoints and who is eligible for the trial and where the trial sites should be located. Okay, let's jump in and talk about clinical trials. The first clinical trial that I'm going to talk about is one that Tessa participated in before we even had a genetic diagnosis and before we started our nonprofit. We found out about the clinical trial from our neurologist, and the drug, which is called Epidiolex, is now an FDA-approved treatment, but at the time, it was only available through a clinical trial. We were eager to participate because we had exhausted all available treatments for seizures. There are around 24 seizure medications, and Tessa had tried all of them in different combinations at varying doses, but she was still having hundreds of seizures a day. On the one hand, we had a very sick child and we were desperate for anything that might work. But on the other hand, at the start of the trial, we had 4 young children, including a newborn who had just been released from intensive care. In this picture, our 3 young girls are in a triple stroller and tiny baby Colton is strapped to my chest. At the time, just getting out of the house with everyone dressed and fed seemed like a Herculean task. So I did wonder how we were going to be able to add a clinical trial into our daily routine. But in the end, the trial design and our family's risk versus benefit assessment helped us decide to participate. Tessa was 10 years old and eligible for the trial because she was having so many uncontrolled seizures. Our hope was that the trial drug would reduce the number of seizures without causing significant side effects. We waited a full year from the time we learned about the trial until we were able to participate in it. It was a really difficult year to live in limbo as we waited for our number to be called. We were fortunate that the trial site was within driving distance from our house. This meant that the cost of the trial was minimal for us. There were no plane tickets or hotel stays. If I remember correctly, the trial drug was free, unlike Tessa's regular seizure medications, which often had significant monthly copays. We did have to do neurology appointments, including EEGs and blood tests before and during the trial, so I would consider the time burden to be moderate. But overall, the potential risks seemed minimal and the potential benefit seemed moderate. We did not think that the medication would suddenly turn her into a typically developing child, but we were hopeful that a reduction in seizures would improve her quality of life. We knew Tessa would receive the medication, not a placebo, which is not always the case in a clinical trial. She was also able to continue her other seizure medications during the trial. The medication was an oil given by mouth, and although trials have fairly strict rules about dosing and length of trial, we knew that we could drop out of the trial and stop the medication if a significant adverse reaction occurred. Although the drug did help some children, sadly we saw no reduction in Tessa's seizures during the trial. The trial did not help our family. Coincidentally, it was during Tessa's Epidiolex trial that we received a genetic diagnosis for Tessa and Colton. The gene responsible for their seizures and developmental problems is SLC13A5. This is a gene that codes for citrate transport. Researchers and clinicians suspected that therapeutics targeting the citric acid cycle could significantly improve Tessa and Colton's health. And again, it took a full year of working with the drug company, regulators, and the trial sites, but we were able to get a trial of a drug called triheptanoin started for the handful of children in the US who had been diagnosed with SLC13A5 deficiency at the time. This time I had not one, but 2 children enrolled in the trial, and they were eligible due to their genetic diagnosis, not due to their age or seizure burden. At the time, Tessa was 11 years old and still having hundreds of seizures a day, and Colton was 1 year old and mostly seizure-free. This trial was more time-consuming and more expensive because we had to fly from California to Texas for some of our trial visits. This picture always makes me laugh because I didn't realize what 3 months of liquid medication for 2 children in a clinical trial would look like. It was this big, heavy box that you can see in the stroller, and I had to figure out how to get it back to California. It was too much liquid to get through security at the airport, and the medication was like liquid gold to us, so I didn't want to take any chances. Long story short, I ended up having to ship it to myself via FedEx, which was not cheap, but it did get the job done. So there will be little hiccups in clinical trials. I had a lot of hope heading into this trial because we finally knew the underlying cause of Tessa and Colton's seizures, and we were participating in a trial that was trying to address the underlying problem. I really thought that this would be our miracle oil. The risk seemed minimal, and the potential benefit, especially for Colton, who was still so young, seemed really high. My kids gagged down this unpalatable oil for months, but no miracles occurred. When our triheptanoin trial did not help the kids, we decided to organize our disease community, and that's actually when we started Tess Research Foundation. With funds raised from friends and family, we were able to give grants to an academic researcher who created a gene replacement therapy for SLC13A5 epilepsy. This gene therapy is still in a preclinical phase, but it's now being spearheaded by Taysha Gene Therapies. And I find myself already thinking and dreaming about trial design and about how a gene replacement therapy trial might be very different from other trials that we've participated in. Rather than an oral medication, a gene replacement therapy will likely be delivered intrathecally in the spinal fluid. It will be a medication developed specifically for this genetic disease, and it will likely be a single shot because there's currently no redosing for AAV gene replacement therapies. I'm hoping that there will be no placebo arm and that eligibility will be based on genetic diagnosis with endpoints that are chosen really wisely. This is why all the pre-work that Nasha described, including natural history studies, are so important. I'm watching other similar trials and realizing that we may have to live near the trial site for weeks or months after the treatment. My children will likely not be able to enroll at the same time, and it may be that only one or neither of them ends up being eligible. To be honest, it all feels a bit overwhelming, but at the same time, a gene replacement therapy is likely the best way to address the underlying problem in the near future. Despite the risks and uncertainties, I hope that my children can receive a gene therapy. This type of therapy is what makes me think that we can change the trajectory of the disease and that someday, not too far in the future, there will be a baby who is diagnosed with SLC13A5 epilepsy, and instead of a doctor telling the parents that the disease is rare and severe and there is no cure, instead that doctor will say, your child has SLC13A5 epilepsy, but there is a treatment that addresses the underlying problem, and we will begin it right away. This can't happen without clinical trials. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Alice.
Thank you both so much for sharing your stories and your experience with those that have tuned in. It's so amazing to listen to what you all have done and what you've been part of and continue to be a part of. It's really very inspiring to listen to. So we have some time now to jump into a few questions and some discussion to pick your brains a bit more and share even more with the audience. And I'll start off with the first question, where if somebody was just listening to the two of you and now they're starting to think about clinical trials, they might be wondering, how can a clinical trial help me or my child with a rare disease? I wanted to hear what you two have to say about that.
Well, I think if there is a clinical trial that addresses the underlying cause or even a symptom, there's a huge benefit for a family that has no treatments for their child to enroll their child in that clinical trial. And I think Kim laid it out really nicely, assessing the risk versus the potential benefits. And of course, that's a conversation every family has to have with themselves to make that decision if it's worth it. But clinical trials, it takes years to go through a clinical trial and then to get FDA to approve it and then get to the market. So you're waiting an extremely long time. And for many of our kids, we don't have that kind of time to wait. So getting them into a clinical trial is really our best option for having a treatment that can really help them in their lifetime. So it's hugely beneficial if there is a trial and your children can be enrolled in it.
Yeah, I agree with what Nasha said. I think that for every family, it's going to be a personal decision. What I laid out was just my family's very personal experience with a few very different types of trials, right? So not all clinical trials are created equally. I tried to show an example of sort of a symptomatic trial and then one that was more of a precision therapy trial. And I also don't think they're mutually exclusive. You may try a symptomatic trial while you're waiting for a precision therapy trial to get off the ground, like we did. We had a long diagnostic odyssey, then we had a long medication odyssey, and now, we're having a long clinical trial to a precision therapy odyssey. So, odyssey is the key word there. It takes a long time, and you make the best decisions for your family in the moments that you can, in the moment that you're in. And if that includes a clinical trial, it's worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kim, you had touched on this a little bit, and same with Nasha. What would be some of the risks that would be associated with a clinical trial? Could you speak a little bit more about that, since we have talked about clinical trials as something that could provide hope, but of course there's always the other side where there's also risk associated?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, for us, as you could tell from our first two trials, they weren't successful, right? So there's the risk that it won't do anything or that it even can do harm, right? So it's not a given that participating in a trial will improve the health of yourself or your family member.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, Kim, a few of your slides had the table where you were assessing from your perspective as the mom. Could you speak a bit more on how you weighed that associated assessment to the risk or the benefit? Did you talk to your doctors? Did you, of course, talk with your family? Did you reach out to others in the patient advocacy community? How did you ultimately decide that?
Yeah, I think over communicating and asking tons of questions is key here, right? So really talking to your care team, your neurologist, your pediatrician, really anyone whose advice you value and who knows your child well or who knows the rare disease patient well, and then of course talking with your family. Like I tried to point out that some of these trials popped up at a time in my life that was not convenient, and that does matter. Like it's okay to say no if the timing isn't right or if it just doesn't seem like it's going to work for your family. So yeah, communication and questions.
Great. Nasha, my next question, I'll start with you. From your perspective, how are patient advocacy groups involved with clinical trials? How can they perhaps help patients or families find a clinical trial to participate in? What role do you really see that patient organization serving?
I see the advocacy group being hugely important in a clinical trial. Most biotech companies, I think all of them can't just reach out directly to patients. So the advocacy group really becomes the conduit. And therefore, there's a lot of responsibility from the advocacy group's perspective. You have to be able to talk to your patients, and you also have to be able to talk to biopharma and to be that liaison. And they're two different languages that you're really speaking. So one is really showing biotech and biopharma that you are prepared, that you can recruit patients if there's a good trial, that you can provide a lot of the data that they are looking for, that you can be that strong conduit for them. And then it's really building trust also with your patient community, because when a trial comes out, they're going to turn to the advocacy group for their opinion on the trial. And it's a lot of responsibility on the advocacy group's perspective to say, like, yes, we would do this for our children, right? This is and again, as Kim said, it's laying out the risk and reward benefit and then conveying that to the advocacy group and then helping them. So during a clinical trial, there's going to be so many questions, and I see an advocacy group really being involved in that, and again, being that strong partner for biopharma to work with patients and to report back to other patients. So it's a hugely important task, and it takes a lot of organization and a lot of compassion and strategic thinking on top of your day-to-day work of actually caring for your children. But I think it's a very important role, and I do think that diseases with stronger advocacy groups are going to be picked by biopharma if there's multiple options for them, because it really makes a huge part of getting patients to the trial much easier.
The next question is for both of you, and if there's someone in the audience today who's just started a nonprofit, if you think back to when you had just started, what would be 3 necessities that you would want to keep in mind in the beginning?
Kim, you go first.
I think the first one is find other patient advocacy leaders and talk with them. Like, there is no better education than just learning from other people's experiences. The goal is not to reinvent the wheel. Like, the goal is to copy someone else's homework, while acknowledging it, and really add to that depth of knowledge. And I think just knowing that this is going to be a long process. So bring your passion, bring your urgency, but I think also have realistic expectations that this process is taking a lot of us longer than we thought that it would, and that's frustrating, and we hope you do it faster than we're doing it. And number 3 would be, like, don't forget that your kid or your rare disease, loved one in your life is the same person the day after diagnosis that they were the day before diagnosis. Birthday parties are still important. Passions and interests and hobbies are still really important. So dive in to this world of rare disease at the level that you want to, but don't forget, the person on the other end of it.
I completely agree with every single thing Kim has said. And she's one of the first advocates that I reached out to, actually. So, and she's totally right. You have to talk to other people. So I'll add 3 other ones. So one, I think, is also you need to find families that are similar to you with the same diagnosis. It's really hard to do it alone. You want to get that core group that you could really trust, and everyone is going to have their own skill set. And so you want to empower people that they can use their skill sets to help the organization. And you kind of have to think about it like you're running a startup. So that's one. The second one is also, I would say, reach out to biopharma, because knowing the road, knowing what the end goal is, will help you build a good strategy. And I find that very important. And I always use this word strategy, and it's a stupid word, I know, but it's, you have so little time and so little resources that you need to make sure that you're doing things that are really helping you, and then not doing other things, because there's so many other things you might get caught into, but you want to make sure you're following a really good path. And an easy example is, I only realized too far down the path that we needed cell lines. And then think about it. You got to get a biobank set up. Patients have to get their samples, send it in. I mean, it takes a long time to do everything. So really nailing that strategy from the beginning will be very helpful. And the third one, I would say, and I have to, patience is something that you will have to learn. Unfortunately, it's we all want the cure tomorrow, and you'll be around a lot of anxious people when you start working with other families that want that as well. And somehow you have to know that this is a long game, and there's many things that are going to go wrong, and you have to hang in there, and keep yourself sane, and be happy every day with whatever happens.
Great. That's so helpful to hear from two very experienced leaders in the field. And I have a follow-up question on something that's been mentioned a few times about over-communicating and reaching out, and even if it's not successful, but just keep trying, keep trying. For those that are new and might be a little intimidated or scared, what advice would you give for how best to have effective communication, or have somebody respond back to you with the information that you need to keep moving forwards? Or is it a trial and error and hoping that somebody out there will respond back with the information that would be the most helpful? Are there any words of wisdom there?
I mean, in my experience, having a medical team that gets it, and that, realizes, like, that doesn't want to give up, that has that vision of, like, we can improve on this situation for your child, is really key. And for me, that meant that we've had a lot of neurologists over the years, until, some doctors would have one idea that they wanted to try out and it wouldn't work, and they didn't have too many other ideas. And so we went on to somebody else who did have more ideas. And there was no animosity involved in it, but it was just okay, we exhausted that resource, let's find the next resource. And it's also about taking breaks a little bit too, having it be okay to just deal with the day-to-day stuff for a little while, and then, getting strengthened and reaching out to other patient advocates, or other people to figure out what the best next steps are.
Yeah, totally agree with that, Kim. And the scientific advisory board you create is so critical. And it's not always the biggest names that are going to help you. It's really getting people that want to be engaged and work with you as you figure out these day-to-day decisions.
So true.
Great. That's good to know. It's both of you, and you were invited to be part of this session because you serve multiple roles and are involved in your respective diseases, as well as across all rare diseases. So I'm curious, when you run into situations where there might be a conflict of interest, how do you balance the various roles that you are part of? Are you very upfront about, okay, now I'm putting on this hat, I'm putting on the parent hat, and this is how it would be, I'm putting on the nonprofit leader hat? I'm sure that, as you guys are aware and meeting a lot of others in the rare disease community, that you have to serve almost more than one role at times. So just wanted to hear what you have to say about that. I guess we'll start with Nasha.
Absolutely. And I mean, I work at a company that has a platform for natural history studies. And so I do have lots of conflicts of interest, but for me, it doesn't feel like that, because my number one priority is always what is best for the children. Always. I know I'm going to have multiple jobs in this space. I'm going to be in this space for the rest of my life. And, both what I feel inside and what I know is right, and also my reputation is going to be more important than anything. So for me, it's always on everything I'm doing. Am I putting the child first? And if not, then I won't do it. And so that makes then wearing multiple hats really a lot easier, because even if it's to a different audience or for a different reason, I still know whatever I'm doing is in the best interest of the children that in the end we're serving.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I do wear hats, everything from being a mother to, heading Test Research Foundation, and many other conflicts of interest seem to pop up in between, but they don't seem to be a big deal as long as you always keep the patient at the center of everything that you're doing, that the answers and the choices become more obvious than you would think.
So if you're stuck in a tough situation where you might be feeling pressure that isn't purely in the best interest of that patient or the child, how best do you step away from a potential opportunity, or do you just keep that main goal very transparent and just use that as your reason for why you can't move in that direction, or do your best to see if there could be any flexibilities to go in the direction that is of the most benefit to the patients?
I get asked this a lot from, parents like, oh, should I do this? Should I not do this? And, I'm happy to talk with them as a fellow parent making the same choices and decisions and figuring out that risk versus benefit. In my slides, I tried to kind of, even from a mom perspective, it's important to kind of know what the touchstones are, what makes sense or doesn't make sense, like a good old fashioned, pros and cons list. But I also say to the other parents, like, I view my job as the founder of Test Research Foundation to try to make as many opportunities as possible available to our families, right? Like, that is my job. It is then the family's decision whether or not to take advantage of those opportunities. I'm not there to force them into them. I'm just there to try to help make opportunities that might not otherwise exist.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to let go things sometimes if something is really hitting, everything is a choice in life. You have to make the right choice also with your values in mind.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. It sounds like that has been a path that has worked for both of you quite successfully. So that's good to hear. The next question, Kim, you mentioned a little bit of this when you were sharing your story. My question for you to start with is regarding a clinical trial. How does it affect more than just the person that has the rare disease? I know you mentioned a little bit about your family with travel costs and your other children that are indirectly affected, but could you touch a little bit more about that? And what are some other potential frustrations besides, as you had mentioned, waiting that 1 year and just sitting around having it be a tough time as you're waiting for the clock to continue moving?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that people don't always realize that if your child is in a clinical trial, it's likely that you have to take time off work in order to, go with your child to the appointments or to the travel to the trial site. You have to get childcare for your other children, right? Like, I have 4 children total. So if one child is participating in a trial, I have to figure out what to do with the other 3. And that can be, complicated and expensive. So a clinical trial often does affect the whole family. And of course, there's just the stress and excitement and all the feelings that get shared across the family in different ways.
Nasha, any thoughts about some of the other ways clinical trials could affect people, and maybe what potential resources you might offer for some of these families that are just looking for clinical trials or just starting out in one? Is there something that could help ease some of the stress that they might not anticipate ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, it is, when you think about if there's clinical trials for epilepsy, for example, it's a really difficult decision if your child is already on multiple epilepsy medications to put one more in there. It's not like you're starting from a blank slate and you're going to see if this new drug works. And our kids are already guinea pigs trying on. To be honest, our kids are in clinical trials every day if you think about it, because you go to your neurologist and they're like, let's try this, let's try that. If that doesn't work, we'll do a cocktail, so it's kind of, you're already in a clinical trial. And I think the real interesting challenge is going to come when these gene therapies start coming down the pipe, right? Because like Kim mentioned, it's a one-shot deal, and you do that and you cannot take another medication. You will not be able to even be in another clinical trial likely. So I think there is where families are going to have to make really hard decisions if they're willing to do so, and is the, again, benefit worth the risk. And we're not, we're seeing gene therapies for some diseases, but it's not mainstream yet by any means. And so that's going to be very interesting. And I don't have a silver bullet answer. I don't think there is one. I think every case is like case by case, and it's talking to experts that you trust. And I always believe in multiple end opinions. So I would never stop at a second opinion. I would go to as many opinions as I could for these very critical decisions. And then, of course, it's up to the parents themselves.
Thank you both so much for everything you've shared so far. To end the session, I have one more question for both of you. The question is, maybe you can take a few seconds to think about too, but it's just any final takeaways that you want to leave those tuning into our session, to have them leave with and have them start to think about. Any final takeaways that you would want our audience to have?
I think for me, the takeaway is that cures start with clinical trials, right? There's going to be unexpected problems, there's going to be failures, but that's that's part of trying to figure out what treatments and cures exist for rare diseases. Like right now, rare diseases have very few treatments. And so there's hope in a clinical trial, but there's also a lot of work. And a lot of that work can be done while you're waiting to get the clinical trial off the ground. And for patient advocates who are helping drive these clinical trials, think about trial design from the patient perspective and use your voice in front of, regulators and biopharma, and, try to really advocate for the patient, because not all trials are created equal. But there are, I think, real things that you can do to ease the burden on the family, including, financial burden, time burden, even the risks can be minimized in certain ways in certain trials. And that is beneficial for everybody, because then you retain patients and you make the trial more successful, and you increase the chance of, having an FDA approved drug at the end of it. So, and then I guess the other thing would be like learn from other groups, right? Like your success, Nasha, is my community's success too. Like there's enough space for victory for all of us, and we really do only make each other stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say my big takeaway is, look, it seems very inundating when you think about all of the work that needs to be done. But actually, if you task it out, it's just, every day you just do the task that you can do. And when you look back, and it's amazing how much you've accomplished. It's just amazing. And it always seems like you have so much more, but it does work that way. And Kim talked a lot about what happens at the clinical trial, and I talked a lot about before all the readiness. And I think the one takeaway is the readiness is really, really critical, and you want to task it out, and you want to just start tackling it and ask for advice, get parents together. Very hard to do it yourself. And just one by one, you will get there, and that clinical trial will come down the pipe, and you'll be prepared for it, and you'll be stronger. You'll have a community. And of course, Kim and I are always available if anyone wants to reach out to us and talk. We're here to help. And as are so many other rare disease parents, it's just an amazing community. So it's not a club that anyone wakes up and says, I want to be in that club, but it is the best club. So all of us are completely there for each other, and, we will all help.